they were sitting at the counter of an all-night eating place somewhere on the highway, Perry smoking and drinking coffee, Joe finishing the last of 2 hamburgers. "Want another one?" Perry said. Joe shook his head, his mouth too full to speak. He felt wonderful, like a baby who has cried his lungs out and then been spanked and fed. He felt inexpressible warmth toward Perry. "Who's Sally?" Perry asked. "Sally? How do you know about Sally? You said her name a lot while you were having that crying jag. Is she an old girlfriend?" "Yep, an old girlfriend." "Lie. That's a fine way to do. He told you he likes the truth. Yeah, but a grown man can't go telling somebody he been babbling about his grandma. What would you like to do now, Joe? It's only 4 a.m. Me? What I want to do? Hell with what I want to do. What you want to do." "I'd like to do what you'd like to do." "No, you say. But Perry, I don't know shit about stuff to do and all." "Yes, you do. You know what you like. Everybody does." "Well, I'll tell you what we used to do in the army. That's all I know about, and it don't amount to nothing. But what we'd do, we'd go into Columbus and pick us up a whore, and that was all there was to it. Never nothing special. Is that what you want now?" "Now? Shoot. You mean now?" "Yes, now. Do you want a woman now?" "Oh, hell. I don't have to have a woman. Shoot. I'm just fine as I am. I don't need anything like that." Joe stirred his coffee in silence for a moment. Then he looked at Perry and said, "Why, you want one?" "Never mind about me. You want a woman, right? Well, you do, don't you? Oh, I suppose if there was something right here pulling at my elbow, I'd just as lief grab onto it. But I, don't want you to go to no trouble." And then, hopefully, he added, "Unless you want one, too." Perry said, "No." "Well then, to the devil with it. Unless you mean there's something close by where it wouldn't be too much trouble, and we could just, Perry rose. "Come on." He started to hand the cashier a $5 bill, but Joe tore it from his hand and gave the woman a 10. Then he took the 5 and pushed it into Perry's hip pocket. Perry smiled and said nothing. On the edge of the parking lot was an outdoor telephone booth. Perry left the door open. Joe leaned against the side of the booth, listening. After a moment of dialing and waiting, Perry said, "Juanita. This is Perry." "Perry." "That's right. Now listen, Juanita. This is what I want you to do for me." "Juanita, don't talk so loud. You're hurting my ear. Hold the phone away from you. You're blasting me. Now listen. Is Dolores still wanting to just listen. Wake her up and give her a good bath, and we'll be around in about half an hour. He hung up. Joe was standing there with his mouth open, shaking his head back and forth slowly, unable truly to grasp his good fortune. He was like a child to whom a guardian angel has chosen to make a material appearance. "Perry, you goddamn sumbitch," he said, his voice trembling with love. In the car, on the freeway, Perry said. "You know, Joe, you've wrecked my evening." Joe was alarmed. What'd I do?" "Well, you see, a great deal of my pleasure comes from spending Marvin's money on other people, and you wouldn't let me pick up that tab back there." Joe laughed, relieved. "No," Perry said, "I'm serious. Don't ever do that again." "Say, Perry, is that Marvin fella, is he some relative or other?" "Oh no, he's just my employer. I'm employed by Marvin." Oh, I see. He's your boss." For a moment, this seemed to clear the matter up, but as Joe reviewed in his mind the scene that had taken place between the two, he realized this new information only increased his confusion. "Boss, huh?" "Yes, that's right. I'm employed by Marvin to virginity. Oh no, Joe said. I'm afraid I'm no virgin, Perry. I am awful goddamn dumb, but I've fucked a plenty. I'm not talking about that kind of virginity. Oh, well then, tell me the kind you're talking about then. Come on, Perry, 'cause I gotta learn this shit. Perry looked at Joe for such a long while that Joe began to be uneasy about the progress of the car along the highway. Then Perry looked away again, shook his head slowly back and forth, as if his eyes had just beheld something unearthly, and said almost under his breath, "You will, you will." In an excess of affectionate good will and gratitude, Joe placed his hand on Perry's shoulder and squeezed it. "You're the best buddy I ever had." This statement seemed incomplete, inadequate. Joe felt a deep impulse to get at the whole truth, to keep talking until he had done some justice to what he felt for Perry. "Listen, you're not just my best buddy, because, listen, been in the fucking army and all that crap, and I've known plenty of guys, but they wasn't none of them done me like this. I mean, you drive me all the way out here to get me laid, and that hamburger back there, and all that don't count for poop. Well, yes it does, it counts for something alright, but the main thing is, you talk to me, goddammit, and you say Joe this and Joe that. And I never heard of anybody, anywhere, anytime having that kind of, well, shoot, friend. Goddammit, friend. You see what I'm getting at here?" "Yes, Joe. But I want you to shut up now. Okay?" Joe withdrew his arm slowly and looked straight ahead. He stopped breathing for a moment and said, "I said too much, didn't I?" "Oh, no, you didn't," Perry said. "But now, I want you to shut up. That's all." "Okay, Perry," Joe said. "That's the least I can do." The little sports car turned off the freeway into a helter-skelter arrangement of trailer parks, building supply places, old houses, and small factories known as Newville, Texas. And then it drove onto an undelineated field on which there were no trees or bushes, no vegetation at all, nothing but bare earth surrounding a big old frame house. No path led to this house, and no driveway. Its placement in that setting seemed haphazard, and if it were the abandoned toy of some god-sized child who tomorrow might choose to wind up its bulldozer and do away with the object completely. Perry parked the MG alongside the place. As they climbed the front steps, a porch light went on. The door opened, and there, holding the screen for them, stood a tall and ungainly person named Tom Baby Barefoot. Tom Baby Barefoot was a light-haired, pale, oddly constructed half-breed. He had a small head and no shoulders to speak of, but from his stomach to the ground he was big and thick and heavy. He wore a gray sweatshirt with Harvard printed on it, faded and torn Levi's, sneakers, and a pair of golden earrings. "Hey, Perry," he said. His voice was soft and high, his accent Texan. From inside the house came an angry growl. piles of bosoms, backsides, and hands. Squatting Buddha-like on the center cushion of a couch on the far side of the room was a small middle-aged hag in a red satin kimono. Her enormous watery eyes were pale blue rimmed with feverish red and sleepless black. These eyes seemed a monstrous liability to the rest of her organism, rapacious, incessantly active. They seemed not to belong to any small woman, but to some great nightmare foe. Across her mouth was a quick, deadly slash of purple paint, and jutting from it a cigarette butt with a hot red coal on the end of it. "Perry!" she shouted in a surprising man's voice. "Evening, Juanita," Perry said. "Evening, my ass," she said, and then to Joe, "Hello, son." While Joe was being introduced to this woman, whose name was Juanita Collins Herlihy, barefoot, her son disassembled himself into a rocking chair and folded his hands across his stomach. "Up, up, up," Juanita commanded, gesturing. 10 bar, princess, 10 bar, bourbon all around." Tom Baby rose with less effort than one might have expected. "Bourbon all round," he said. As he left the room, he walked past a remarkable article leaning on the wall next to the dining room archway, an 8-foot stuffed toy in the image of a giraffe. Joe, in his own mind, allowed Tom Baby to climb onto this toy giraffe and ride away, not just into the dining room, but clear out of Texas. But then the giraffe grew weak under its burden, and there was a dreadful collapse, with many skinned knees and broken limbs. And while he was coping with this crisis in his imagination, he and Perry, in reality, took seats in big chairs that faced Juanita across a mirror-covered cocktail table. She said to Perry, "went through one pitch of a commotion here for you tonight." Perry smiled. "You always do, Juanita." "Look," she thrust forward a hag's hand, tobacco-stained, dirty, its nails bitten to the quick. But what she meant to display was a pair of fresh scratches on the back of the hand. "She'd done that to me when I woke her up, the goddamn animal." Then suddenly, Juanita tossed her big eyes into Joe Buck's face. "You better like animals here." Joe grinned at her, but he was sick. What he saw as he spoke was a cage with a creature half lady, half tiger, padding back and forth, and it starved. But he didn't want it. Didn't want any kind of animal at all. What he wanted was something soft and fat and raised his glass on the table in front of her and poured another drink for himself. Juanita put down the dish and picked up the glass. And get some music. What are we running here? A cat house or a funeral parlor? Well now, that's a question, Tom Baby said. If you're the main attraction, Mother, I'd be halfway inclined to think it might be a cross between— Shut up! Juanita's voice rattled the place. Tom Baby left the room. I always like to make it clear to strangers, Juanita told Joe, that this big-assed rooster with the dimple where his dick ought to be. Yeah, that's right. And a sack of gumdrops for balls. Well, he ain't no son of mine. Not by a damn sight. He nothing but a mistake of some goddamn broken-down night shift nurse at the General Jones Hospital in Shreveport. She switched kids on me. You think I'm joking about a thing like that? Listen, I remember the night plain as day, too. The night I got planted with that kid. I remember things everybody else is forgotten. I got total recall. I remember where it was and how I was lying and how it felt and what happened after. Darlington barefoot and me lying out on his porch on top of the world, drink in one hand, looking at the moon in the other. You remember the whole shebang like it was 10 minutes ago. Don't tell me poor Tom Baby is what you get to remember a time like that with. Besides, my kid had black hair when he came out of me. I know. I was wide awake. I seen him come out, and he was black-headed. What else? Being son of Darlington Barefoot of Brownsville, was he gonna have for hair? Pink? Shit. And what did they shove at me next morning to feed but this mess? Whole mouth and rear end. Let me tell you, my titties dried up in horror on the spot. Look here. She pulled apart the red kimono and showed 2 stringy breasts. Think I'm joking? That day to this, not a drop of milk come out of these things. Dry. The whole point of the story, said Tom Baby, barefoot, returning from the dining room, where he had caused the sound of the ink spots to pervade the place with "Someone's rockin' my dreamboat," is to show her poor old boobs. If she waits for a demand, well, you can just about imagine, I'm sure, how long a wait that'll entail. Juanita's eyebrows were cocked in imitation of a listening attitude. I caught every syllable of that insult. P-head. My notebook is crammed full. God help you. God help you. No, Mother, you misunderstood me. All I said was, they'd like to see your vagina next. Ready? Here's your music. Ta-ta. What'd he say? What'd he say? Tell me, Perry. Oh, said Perry, enunciating carefully. He said he hoped Dolores would be ready pretty soon. So do I. Yeah, I'll bet. Well, Darlington Barefoot took one look at his thing and smelled. He was born with a caul. Had to hold my nose every time I come near it. Anyway, Barefoot had one look at it, and he was on his way. Took off like greased lightning. Can you blame the man? I mean, look at it his way. His daddy, Darlington's daddy, was a goddamn brave. So, what was he gonna do? Take this Glen case, Miss Jane Withers here, back to his tribe and say, meet the kid? Fat chance. Therefore, said Tom Baby, Mother, who was already flat on her back, had no difficulty at all in making a living, except that she was forced to specialize in faulty vision types, drunks, was my own. Call me a damn fool. I don't mind. I make no bones about it. I love you too, Mother, said Tom Baby. And I love, let's see, snakes and policemen and war and big hairy spiders and oh, what else? Oh, I know, cancer of the rectum. Whatever he's saying, no matter how sassy it sounds, it's based on affection and respect. Right, Tom Baby? Now the ink spot with the falsetto was asking, when evening shadows creep, do I lose any sleep over you? And somewhere in the back of the house, a door slammed. Dolores just rang for you, said the Indian to his mother. Go light a fire under her. Tell her I said a horro mismo. Tom Baby left the room, and while he was gone, Juanita said, that poor thing. Perry, what's to become of him? I worry so. Every time he goes to New Orleans or Dallas or anywhere at all and tries to make a living, some policeman chases his ass back home to Mama. Enough to break your heart. So naturally, I put him to work here. Do you suppose I'm too soft? He just come back from Pensacola. Was gone 3 months this time. I thought, Christ, maybe I'm rid of him. But he come dragging his ass back last week. Don't know what happened in Pensacola. He won't even talk about it. He's ugly. He's a fag. He's put together like Donald Duck and nobody can stand the sight of him. Except me. So what am I gonna do? I sent him to beauty school. He can't make a curl to save his life. Can hardly wipe his own twat. Imagine all the hell I've had and him not even my own. I'll tell you what's wrong if you want to know. Inferior blood is what it is, inferior blood. And there's not a goddamn thing you can do about inferior blood. She took a tissue from the box on the table and blew her nose hard. Oh, I know. You're not supposed to cry in this business. Well, I'm sentimental. Damn it all. And I do as I please, and nobody don't like it can take a flying leap at the moon. Juanita finished the liquor in Tom Baby's glass, and while the stuff was working inside of her, she hunched her shoulders forward, held her head back, and pressed her lips together, eyes closed. Then, like a priestess of some weird cult, she took a deep breath and pointed in quick succession to various parts of herself, head, throat, chest, stomach, saying, pain here, pain here, pain here, pain here. Who cares? Not me. Pain don't bother me. Reach me that bottle, Perry. Tom Baby, barefoot, came simpering into the room and settled into his rocking chair. Dolores wanted to know, he reported with relish, how old the senior was. I said, roughly 73. She's in there crying. Juanita made him repeat this until she had heard it. Then she disentangled her legs and got to her feet. In the process, Joe caught a glimpse of her knees, nothing a similarity to those of his grandmother, with this difference. In Juanita's there was nothing very sad in all that boniness. She said to Joe, listen, I'm gonna be rude as hell. I'm gonna take Perry into the kitchen and tell him something secret here. Eager to be agreeable, Joe gave a little wave of the hand and arranged his face in a way that he hoped would convey to her an impression of long familiarity with the necessity for telling secrets in whorehouse kitchens. Juanita, on her way out of the room, stopped at his chair and to look him over at saw fags there. Fags and money and hungry women. Young stud like this in the stable, I'd clean up good. She shrugged and walked toward the door. But look what I got, will you? Juanita jabbed the air with her thumb in the direction of Tom Maybe Barefoot. Then she and Perry went through the dining room into the back of the house. Joe knew good and well that the woman who had just left the room was a frightful person. She had said things appalling enough to shrivel the balls of Tom Baby Barefoot a dozen times over. She was clearly selfish and callous and disagreeable in all possible ways. He knew, too, that in Tom Baby, here, hands folded, grandmother-like across his stomach, was a cold, skinny black tongue connected to a heart full of poison, and the house itself, with so many darknesses beyond the darknesses he could see, was fearsome as a nest of vipers. But still, he would have moved into it with these persons on a second notice. For they were not one alone in the place, but two, sharing the horrors of it and of one another, and he saw clearly without knowing what name to give it. Love? Hate? Or how it came to be, or what it could lead to. Some kind of priceless safety in their connection with one another. Joe felt the soft eyes of the half-breed upon him. He lifted his bourbon glass and said, "Well, here you go, Tom Baby." Tom Baby had no drink. His hands were fidgeting with one another on his stomach, and he was looking at Joe with a damp smile on his mouth. "Oh yes, here I go," he said, and he kept on smiling, kept on looking. After a moment in which the Andrews sisters sang the shrine of St. Cecilia, Juanita appeared in the doorway. "Son?" She was beckoning to Joe with her hand. Come on. We've got something for you." Joe followed Juanita through the dining room and into the long, dark hallway. They stopped at the closed door at the end of the hall. Juanita hit the door with the back of her hand. "All right, Dolores." She looked at Joe. "Go ahead, son. Enjoy yourself." She turned the knob and gave him a gentle shove forward. In a corner of the room stood a girl of no more than 17, short, dark, clean-faced. She wore a long, blue robe held tight about her body, as if for protection. She looked at Joe with a mixture of fear and hostility, and seemed to be trying to think of ways to keep him at bay. Joe closed the door and took a step toward her. The girl stiffened as he approached. He said, "What's the matter, miss?" But the girl said nothing. Puzzled, Joe started to leave the room, but when his hands was on the doorknob, the girl said, "No." He turned to look at her again. The girl studied his face for a moment, and then the fear and hostility gradually drained from it, leaving nothing, just resignation. She turned her back to him and began slowly to untie the robe. When she had stepped out of it, she walked quickly to the bed in a way that made Joe feel he was stealing something from her. The girl lay flat on her back, stared at the ceiling. She was motionless. After a moment, Joe walked over to the bed and looked at her face. She wouldn't turn her eyes to him. He tried not to look at her body, feeling it had not truly been offered to him, but his eyes were not entirely under his control. They traveled quickly over the bed, saw a kind of sweet kissed it and smiled. Joe kissed her hand. Then she took his again and kissed each of the fingers in turn. Joe returned the gesture, and then he kissed the palm of her hand. They looked into one another's eyes for a long time, and then the girl began to frown, and there were tears on her eyelashes. Apparently, she had things to say, too, things that were not going to be said, not on this night, not to Joe Buck, maybe never to anyone. He bent over her and touched the tears away with his tongue, and then he withdrew his face from hers and smiled at her, showing all those fine white teeth, and the girl began to laugh. He pulled at his clothes. In a moment, they were both on the bed, holding, being held, exploring, caressing, touching, sampling, kissing. And then there was a certain preliminary moment, a very quiet moment, a gentle, dangerous, important moment in which neither of them breathed until they breathed together. And this was followed by the deepest embrace of all. And then there took place the easy beginnings of a giving and a taking and a taking and a giving that caused the girl's eyes to lose their power of focus. And at a certain moment he waited and waited and waited, causing her to call out to him in her own tongue words of love, which he nonetheless understood. And when he knew he had waited long enough, he began to build for her the finest thing of which he was capable. And then suddenly he stopped moving. The girl clutched his shoulders. Joe's head was cocked to one side, listening for something, and then he withdrew himself from her so quickly that the girl called out in pain, and he jumped from the bed and looked toward a closet in the corner of the room. The door was ajar. The girl sat up in bed. Hey, you crazy! But Joe remained standing there, and after a moment the door was pushed all the way open from within. He saw that it was not a closet at all, but an adjoining room. Seated on a stool was Perry. Behind him stood Juanita, and towering above both of them was Tom Baby barefoot. Perry was smiling. "Go ahead, Joe," he said. "Don't let us stop you." Within seconds, Perry was on the floor of the bedroom, and Joe sat astride his chest, still naked, and working hard with his fist, bent on obliterating that smile. The girl screamed, but Perry himself offered no resistance whatever. In fact, he looked directly into Joe's eyes in a way that was clearly calculated to provoke him further. Juanita began barking out short, unintelligible phrases made up of ugly words and Spanish ones. Joe, stopping for a moment, held his fist over Perry's face. "Don't smile anymore," he begged. "Quit it now, please." But Perry would not quit, and the blues continued. The girl was now behind Joe, pulling at his shoulders with all her strength, and then Juanita and Tom Baby were surrounding him too, and there were hands all over Joe's naked body as he was drawn away from the bleeding man on the floor. Joe struggled to free himself, and then a fist caught him in the stomach. This fist belonged to Juanita. It took Joe's breath. On the edge of the bed, he doubled over, trying to pull some air into him. Surrounding his lowered head were a number of legs that made a kind of cell around him. Still, he felt hands all over him, and some of them were soft, damp hands, and they glided all over his back and along his thighs. Combining with the pain in his stomach, these hands sickened him, and he began to retch and vomit, but nothing came out. Still the hands continued, and one of them began to manipulate him in a surprising way that caused in him a kind of nightmare panic, and when he was able to achieve a little stale air. He used it to gird himself for further struggle. But at this point, a voice, Juanita's, said in a loud whisper, "You want it, Tom baby. The only one way you gonna have it." Now there was a crash in which everything was at once obliterated and instantly recreated, but in a totally different perspective. The room had become a hole, shaped something like a well, and Joe was lying in the bottom of it, looking up. No, it was only his head that was on the bottom. Everything else, even his own body, lying on the bed, was above him, and beyond his toes, way up near the top of everything, were people standing, the half-breed and the hag. They were arguing, but their voices were muted, almost inaudible. It was as if his ears were submerged in something liquid that deadened his hearing. And now the woman floated out of view, and Joe Buck seemed to be alone with a big yellow-looking thing leaning over the edge of the bed. It was reaching down with both hands toward Joe, and then the opening at the top of the hole was completely covered over by this fat form, darkening everything so that it was no longer possible to see. Joe felt the air had been cut off, but when he gasped, he found there was still some left for breathing. He was desperate for light and began to try to work his neck muscles in a way that might pull his head up into the light. Gradually, he became aware that some effort was being made up above. Something was trying to release him from the anguish and the darkness. It was as if some giant force were being applied at the top of the well, drawing Joe slowly upward, 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 using his sex as a handle. As he knew himself to be closer and closer to freedom, the constriction he felt became more and more intolerable. He fought hard to cooperate with the force that was drawing him place or to defile it in some way. At length, he realized the entire city of Albuquerque was in this category, and his thought invited his mind to think in broader terms. If Houston were no better than Albuquerque, it was a safe bet that Hong Kong and Des Moines and London town were no better than Houston. Following this logic, the map of the entire world was quickly filled in with the color of his fury. But in this sweeping view, he felt something had been glossed over or left out. Some first-class son of a bitch was playing hide-and-seek in his memory. But who? Or what? And all at once, he thought of Sally Buck. Sally Buck on the telephone. "Joe, how you doing, honey? That's nice. Listen, I got me a late appointment, and I'll be so tired when I get out of here. I might just step around the corner to the Horse and Saddle for a beer or two. Handsome, how are you feeling? Listen, your grandma's going to Santa Fe for over the 4th. Looks like I got me a new beau. How's that for an old lady, huh? You'll be all right here in town, won't you?" Sally Buck, standing in the doorway of her bedroom. "Believe I'll just hit the hay, sweetheart. Get a decent night's sleep for a change. Did you have a nice day? Better tell me all about it in the morning. I'm too tired to follow what you're saying." Sally Buck in her beauty shop. "Listen, sugar, this waiting room is for ladies, and you know how they are. You take that magazine along home if you want, and don't play too hard now. Hey, Toots, there's no point in you waiting around for me. I might have to stop off at Mommy's and Ed's anyhow. Can't you tuck yourself in like a big fella? My bar card? Didn't I just sign one last week? You mean it's been 6 weeks? Lord, how time flies. Give it here. Where do I do it? On the back? There. Now run along, baby. I got me a head in 3 waiting for a set." Sally Buck. He couldn't remember why he'd ever loved her so much. Silly, pinch-faced old chatterbox. Never sat still, always dabbing at her nose with perfume, so you couldn't smell the liquor, but you could anyway, or pulling dollar bills out of her pocketbook to buy off old promises she'd made, forever fooling with a compact or picking lint out of her dress whenever you tried to tell something to her. All he could think of in her favor was how spindly her legs were, and how sad it was to look at her big bony knees when she crossed them. was as if he had to feed just so many millions of dishes into the steaming jaws of that machine, and then it would be appeased and belch up enough money to. He wasn't certain what the money was for. He only knew he had to get some of it together in order to cause something to happen. He went about with the single eye of a man with a plan, but he didn't quite know what the plan was. 3 mornings a week he spent in a gymnasium where he performed strenuous exercises, punched a bag, and swam the length of the pool 8 times. He watched his body acquire new strength and agility. He massaged his scalp and fooled with his hair a lot, and he became obsessed with the acquisition of a Western wardrobe, carrying with him night and day a feeling, a belief that everything would change for the better when he had created himself in a certain new image. He knew what the image was, that of a cowboy, but he never did press himself too far on the question of how that image would make his life different. There is an Indian legend that at a certain time in the life of a young man he is given a dream in which he sees a mask, and when he awakens he must set to work on carving a real mask in that dream image. This is the mask he must wear into battle in order to be victorious. It was as if Joe Buck had had such a dream, and his life was given over to the carving of the mask. He wasted little time these days in longing for the company of others, or in any kind of brooding. If he had no kin in the world, who was there to yearn for? But he did do a lot of aimless wandering at night when he left the cafeteria. To Joe, it was not aimless at all. Ask him what he was doing, and he would have brushed the question aside as if his purpose were to be found somewhere deeper than questions and answers would penetrate. But he was clearly searching the town for something. He kept his eyes wide open and alert, scanning the nighttime streets of downtown Houston like a warrior scout. Very little of what he saw seemed worth remembering. Most of what passed his eye left no more of a mark on him than images leave on the face of a mirror. But there were, from his many nights of wandering and looking, 3 pictures that had somehow fallen through to a level in him deeper than the surface, and these in memory showed themselves to him over and over again. One was a cutout image of a young Hollywood actor flat-lighted on top of a movie marquee. He stood there with his suntan snarl in full color, 2 stories bigger than life, legs apart, pelvis thrust forward, and he was in the act of turning a big gun on you. The barrel of it was coming at you thick and gleaming, and it was about to go off. The second article in this nighttime collection of images was a brief scene on a street corner. A long white convertible was stopped for a red light. The woman in the driver's seat was looking at a tall, handsome young man in Western clothes standing at the curb. Her mother died under her, but she kept on looking at the young man. After a moment she said, "I can't get it started without help." And the young man said, "I'll bet you can't, honey." The third picture to remain in him from these walks was the only one he couldn't enjoy looking at later, but whether or not he liked it, it was one of the 3 and would not be discarded. This was a